discuss several episodes of the new nationalism, the new populism, in order to demonstrate that it's about more than just nationalism. What we're dealing with here is more than just questions of national sovereignty and nationalism. I think if we reduce it too much to nationalism, we're being very narrow, and I think there's people who have political agendas that would like to keep it narrow. But I think it involves a larger kind of revolt in many ways, a kind of larger issues of political values, traditional values in many ways, among different populations, and these are sometimes different, they vary from country to country, but there are certain things that underlie all of them. Certainly patriotism, or nationalism if you prefer, is one of those. Questions of sovereignty are important manifestations of this revolt. Immigration has made those questions of sovereignty very important also. But I think there's other factors involved, other values that are equally important to nationality and nationalism and patriotism. One of them, I think, is religion and religious faith. I think there's an element of religion in all of this. And in many ways, the cutting edge of politics in the world today, both within individual countries domestically and externally in international politics, is religion. I think we've moved from a world where, the 20th century we saw politics in terms of, on the left we saw politics in terms of social conflict and economic conflict in Marxism and socialism. On the right, politics was seen in terms of nationality and extreme forms of race. But I think we've shifted the politics in this century, increasingly since the end of the Cold War. The big polarity in the world today, in many ways, is religious. The division of the world is religious. And I could be even more specific, I'm going to be even a little more adventurous and say that it's even further than that. There's one aspect of religion, there's a number of aspects of religious manifestations of politics which are important. But overwhelmingly, the one that is by far the most important manifestation of the new religious politics is the politics of the family and sexuality. This is the manifestations of conflict. Again, both within the developed world and in the West, domestically, and internationally, with the Islamic world and with civilizations like the Hindu world. Religion and increasingly the sexual manifestations, religion is the manifestation that is played out and created conflict. So I want to just talk about 4 instances of the new nationalism, especially in Europe and in the West today, and show that they are, to show how this aspect of politics, this new cutting-edge aspect of politics is important, is actually a kind of subtext that runs through all of this. The 4 examples that I want to talk about are Poland, especially the election of the PIS government about 18 months ago, or a little more than that, in October of 2015, very conservative government. In fact, Poland has a very conservative legislature. There's no liberal left-wing parties even represented in the Polish legislature. All the politics run from center-right to the right. The other second one, which I'll talk about very briefly, is Hungary under the Fidesz party, Viktor Orban, which actually predates the PIS government in Poland. It goes back actually to the 90s, the first Fidesz government in Hungary. They're very similar. The third manifestation, again, these are all linked together in other people's minds, so it's not unusual I've chosen these 4. The third one is the Brexit, the British revolt against the European Union and the decision to pull out of the European Union. And the 4th one is Trump's America, which I'll talk about just briefly. But I can give other examples. I'm just giving these are the ones, the most obvious ones. And I want to show in many ways that, especially in the European countries, Poland, Hungary, Britain, are often interpreted as clashes with the European Union. But in many ways, I want to argue that some of the clashes, some of the manifestations of these revolts are in many ways kind of procedural, in a way. And that but underneath are issues of more substance, which are sometimes not always those that are on the radar screen of the media and of academics, even like us. All of these have a number of features in common, these 4 episodes. There's intense media hostility to these events in the 4 countries, intense hostility from the academic community, us, intense hostility from the international organizations that we just heard about, the European Union, the United Nations and so forth. The failure of public opinion polling is another one in both Brexit and the Trump election, but also to some extent in the PIS election, the public opinion experts failed. Another aspect I won't talk about much, but in both of them there's a very strong manifestation of two aspects of politics which are very undemocratic, the more undemocratic branches of government, the judiciary and the bureaucracy, whereas these revolts have taken place more through the democratic branches of government, the parliaments or the executive or popular referendum. And another aspect that they all have in common is much of the opposition to all four of these revolts have come for reasons that are not always clear or obvious. They have come from feminists and from so-called women's marches. Now, why is this the case? It's not always obvious why this should be the case, but it is. So all of these episodes have a subtext of sexual politics and family politics, which again is not always clear. Just briefly, the PIS election 18 months ago, the conservative government was elected in Poland. Since that time, there have immediately been clashes over several issues. One is the constitutional tribunal, the allocation of power in the country's constitutional tribunal. Secondly was the allocation of power in the state-run media. There have been clashes over who controls the state-run media. And thirdly, there's been conflict, direct conflict with the European Union, between the Polish government and the European Union, which is intensified by the question of migrants, settling migrants from the Middle East, but it didn't start there. It predated that by months. So these are the main issues. So again, these are the issues that have been on the media radar screen. But underneath this, there's another issue that actually was much more, in many ways, much more emotive in Poland, which wasn't on the media radar screen for months, and that was the popular referendum on abortion. These other things I mentioned, the judicial dispute, the dispute over the state-run media, the clash with the European Union, all this was provoked by the government. Okay, but at the same time, in Poland, at the grassroots level, Polish citizens, mostly young people, citizens, people your age, collected something like, I forget how many signatures they collected, two or three times as many signatures. They needed 1 million signatures. I think they collected 2 million signatures for an initiative to get a restrictive abortion law onto the ballot before the parliament. Okay, so this wasn't a government measure. This was a citizen grassroots measure. And as the European Union was attacking the Polish government in Poland for what it called a threat to the rule of law and for destroying democracy, the people of Poland were circulating these petitions, this initiative, referendum in effect, to place this initiative on the ballot. So if anything, the people of Poland, the students and those who gathered these signatures, were more radical or more conservative, if you like, than the actual government. And that was what really mattered to them, is the abortion issue. It's also true, so my point is here, that what the real issue of grassroots interest to the Polish electorate was not the constitutional tribunal, the media, and these other things. It was abortion. It was a family issue, an issue involving the family and sexuality. Interestingly, too, there was a huge march when this finally got to the ballot, when this finally got put in front of the parliament, the Polish parliament, just about a year ago, a little more than a year ago. What happened? There was huge demonstrations in Warsaw and other cities by the feminist groups, dressed in black shirts. I thought the symbolism of that was kind of, I don't know, significant. They were wearing black shirts to march this. And the Polish parliament backed down. They threw in the towel. They were intimidated by these marches, and they threw in the towel and they refused to consider this. And they lost a lot of support as a result of that. So my point is there that the subtext of sexual politics and family politics was actually more important than the other issues that were on the radar screen. Natalia Duholm of Lifesite News put it very clearly. She said, this is simply the purest form of democracy in action at a time when the European Union was calling Poland a threat to democracy, was labeling Poland as a threat to democracy. Okay, Hungary, just briefly. I don't want to talk about this a lot because I haven't had as much experience with it myself, but Orban's government has been very concerned with marriage issues and family values. They sponsored the World Congress of Families last month in Budapest. And they've been pushing these kinds of issues as well. I might also point out that throughout, here in Romania and throughout Central and Eastern Europe, these kind of issues have also become rapidly ascendant. You have a referendum coming up on traditional marriage and the Constitution. Here in Poland, it's divided the parties in interesting ways. The President Johannes is against this referendum. The socialists, ironically, are for it. I could make some observations about the nature of politics in Romania and other countries like Moldova and Russia too. Why the socialists are coming out in favor of family values. Zeman in the Czech Republic has done some things that are similar. There's great ironies involved there. But other countries in Eastern Europe, this has manifested itself also. In Slovakia, some statements by the former dissident Czarnogórsky. But perhaps the biggest one, I wasn't going to talk about this in detail, would be Russia. Much of the controversy in Russia in the last, 5 years, has concerned these kinds of issues of the family and sexuality. The famous homosexual propaganda bill, the bill that the Duma passed prohibiting homosexual propaganda toward children, was one of the things that it elicited a huge outcry and alienation of many of the elites of the Western world against Putin and against the Russian government. And the other one was the famous Pussy Riot protest, where kind of half-naked feminist groups disrupted religious services in the Christ the Savior Cathedral in Moscow. So there's a subtext very much running underneath also our relations with Russia. Russia's claim, whether you accept it, whether you accept Russia's claim to be the worldwide leader of Christian family values, maybe you see this as cynical, maybe it is cynical, maybe it's just pure opportunism. But it's nevertheless struck a nerve. And it is being taken seriously in countries like, in countries like Hungary and Slovakia. I can talk about that a little more. Let's talk a little about, just briefly, about the third example, the Brexit example, the British referendum on the European Union. What in here is, what's the subtext here of family issues? Well, it's actually quite striking, actually. It's still going on, and it's not ended by any means. A year ago, the British held a referendum to decide whether to continue in the European Union. The referendum, as you know, overwhelmingly the British voted in favor of the electorate to withdraw from the European Union. Immediately after this referendum, the government fell. Cameron government fell because they had put their confidence in this referendum and it had failed. He was immediately succeeded by another conservative government under Theresa May. Now people have been asking this, although they haven't asked it enough. Why Theresa May? What was her authority for becoming Prime Minister of Britain? She was on the wrong side of the referendum. She was in favor of remaining in the European Union. Her side lost. So what authority or mandate did she have to become Prime Minister of Britain? All on top of that, as she was being made Prime Minister of Britain, there was a huge discussion in the media about that her government represented an attack on privilege, okay, in the form, and what's known as an attack on private education. Okay, because she was opposed to, had some aspects of her government are opposed to private education. That her government represented, I'm quoting from conservative sources here, social reform to relieve the disadvantaged. That her government was going to create a government not for the privileged few, but for every one of us. And that above all, her government was going to create gender equality. Well, what were the mandates for all these things from the referendum? Had the referendum been about attacks on privilege and private education, social reform to relieve the disadvantaged? Had the referendum been on government by all of us rather than the privileged few? And had the referendum been on gender equality? Well, the answer is no. Had nothing to do with any of these things. So again, I ask, what was her authority? What was her mandate? What was her credentials to become Prime Minister of Britain? The odd thing, too, was that she staffed her government mostly with 70% Remainers and less than 30% Brexiters. Okay, so what was the authority for that? They had just lost the referendum, and yet they did 70% of the seats in the cabinet. What was the authority from all of this? The other thing that was quite striking at the time was there was no discussion whatsoever of Theresa May's role as Home Secretary. And I'll come back to this in a moment. But she was basically judged by completely different standards than any other prime minister, any other candidate for prime minister. Jonathan Foreman, who wrote a very strong critique of of her record as Home Secretary, and whose article, the critique he wrote, was killed by the Daily Telegraph. It was accepted for publication in the Daily Telegraph, killed under pressure from Theresa May's campaign. And he wrote, it was as if the icy Home Secretary had a dark magic that warded off all critical scrutiny and all criticism. In other words, she seemed to be immune from criticism, like they used to say about Ronald Reagan, the Teflon president. And she seems similar to be a kind of Teflon prime minister. Somewhere along, now that the Conservatives lost this election when they were expecting to win it, they lost the election. Nobody has pointed the finger at the Conservative Party leadership and said, why was this prime minister chosen a year ago to be prime minister? What credentials did she have for being prime minister? Nothing. Nothing has been discussed about this at all. She certainly wasn't chosen by the rank and file. There were three major figures who had pushed very hard for Brexit. Boris Johnson, David Davis, and Michael Gove. All of them none of them were even considered seriously for prime minister. The only other person considered seriously for prime minister was Andrea Leadsom, who was immediately attacked for her role as a Christian and her belief in family values. She was savagely attacked in the conservative press as well as the liberal press, and she was excluded from the being prime minister. Not only that, but after Theresa May became prime minister, the woman that attacked Andrea Leadsom, Amber Rudd, then moved into the role of Home Secretary. Okay, the one who had led the kind of hatchet job against Andrea Leadsom succeeded Theresa May as Home Secretary. So what was and then the other thing that was quite striking about this was that nothing really changed. The Cameroons, the modernizers they were called, who had led Britain into Brexit, were excluded from the government. But the people that were brought in, okay, they represented kind of the left wing of the Conservative Party. They were then replaced by Conservative ministers who were even more left wing than they were. Even though the country, the electorate, had just voted a very conservative referendum in favor of withdrawing from the European Union. So it was almost as if it was as if the British didn't do anything. It was as if the British electorate counted for nothing. And Theresa May, they just simply staged, again, a kind of coup d'etat. It was widely, I could quote you many commentators in the British press who pointed out that the Cameroons, the Cameron's cabinet, was replaced with female faces from the same out-of-touch governing class. And as Janet Daly wrote in the Daily Telegraph, maybe the problem with the Cameroons, the modernizers, was not that they were too glib or too wrong in their policies, but that they were simply too male. Okay. Well, again, one has to ask nowadays, now that the Conservatives have lost this election, what was this? Why did this happen? Why did the Conservatives shoot themselves in the foot? Not so much in this election, but shoot themselves in the foot a year ago when they chose this prime minister. It's clear. The other thing that's very clear about this election in Britain was that it was very much a referendum on terrorism. Right? The British had just been attacked several times by terrorists. And it's very clear that this was a referendum not only on a prime minister who had allowed her country to be attacked by terrorists, but who had previously spent, 6 years as Home Secretary, who should have been fortifying her country against terrorist attack. What did Theresa May do for 6 years as Home Secretary? Was she fortifying the country against terrorism? According to Jonathan Foreman, whose article I mentioned earlier, she did nothing to fortify her country against either terrorism or immigration. She spent the 6 years doing two things: pushing for same-sex marriage, which had no authority in the Tory party election manifesto. There was nothing in the Tory party election manifesto in favor of same-sex marriage, but she pushed it through the cabinet and passed it through the parliament. So she spent her time same-sex marriage. The other thing she spent her time doing as Home Secretary was promoting programs on violence against women, domestic violence, and various forms of sexual assault and these sorts of things. Okay, so in other words, she was kind of flirting, if you like, forgive the expression, with the radical feminist movement and the radical homosexual movement at a time when her country was being attacked by truly dangerous terrorists. And then the irony of the whole thing, afterward, she loses the election, the Conservatives lost the election, they find themselves in a situation where who do they have to negotiate with in order to govern? They have to negotiate with the Democratic Unionist Party, the most conservative major party in Britain, a Northern Ireland party, whose main platform was what? Opposition to same-sex marriage. Okay? So she's finding herself in this position of having to strike a, if you like, a dirty deal with the very party that stood against the things that she was pushing. And her own Scottish minister, by the way, who is an open lesbian, is in defiance of her on this issue of negotiating with the Democratic Unionist Party, this truly conservative party of Northern Ireland. So all through this election, all through the referendum and the election, even though it's allegedly about Brexit and about withdrawing from the European Union, the real tension all the way through this has been the politics of sexuality in the family, same-sex marriage, measures of violence against women, and of course, and religious issues, such as, by the way, Northern Ireland is the most religious, the most Christian, and the most conservative part of Britain by far. And that's why that she's having to strike a deal with the Northern Ireland Party in order to continue governing. Okay, well that's a brief, my spin on the British election. On the Trump thing, and I'll talk about this briefly because it's already been discussed a bit, but the Trump election, in some ways it's the most charged with sexual politics of any of them, because after all, you had two candidates. One was really the leading figure of radical feminism in the United States, Hillary Clinton, and the other was an alleged, sexual predator, so we're told, Donald Trump, and a misogynist as he was labeled and so forth, and of course his famous gaffe about in the van about groping women. So in many ways, this was the most sexually charged election of all, and yet nobody discussed it anywhere through the election. It never came up. There was almost nothing about feminism, almost nothing about sexual politics, almost nothing about homosexuality. These issues were just studiously avoided. Why? Because neither side wanted to do it. They were motive, especially the Democrats didn't want to do it. Hillary already had, as they thought, the vote of single women and homosexuals. So she had nothing to gain and everything to lose by bringing it up. So it didn't appear that this was a major issue. And yet, obviously, it ran all the way through the election. It was the major issue all the way through. Well, what do I have to say about that? If it wasn't brought up, what is there to say about it? I would say one thing, it does have something. The one thing that is interesting to me about the election and where this does come up is that is the way that the polls and the mainstream political elites were caught with their trousers down, so to speak. They were caught completely off guard. They completely failed to predict this election. Why did they fail? Well, they failed for a number of reasons, which have partly been talked about. But I would say the main reason they failed, the main reason people lied to the opinion pollers, was because they were scared. They were terrified. The radical left today in the West, especially in the United States, doesn't argue, doesn't debate, doesn't discuss issues. Its main purpose, its main technique is accusations. It accuses. It accuses people of wrongdoing. It accuses people of being racist, misogynist, homophobic, Islamophobic. It accuses people. It's not just cultural. It's not just a matter of disagreement anymore. We've gotten a culture in which criminal or semi-criminal or quasi-criminal accusations have become the currency of politics. Okay, where we are accusing people of and to be fair, Trump did this too. He said Hillary Clinton should be in jail. Well, that's the rough and tumble of politics, I admit. But my point is that both sides play this game a bit. But it sounds like some of it's the rough and tumble of politics, but some of it reflects, I think, a very dangerous trend in our politics. The use of criminal accusations, the use of criminality, the use of judicial procedures, not always criminal, sometimes civil, to settle political differences. And this is a very dangerous trend, but it was very strong in the election, and it's become very strong generally. And I would argue that the cutting edge of this, the vanguard of this trend, is in sexual politics. And you see it very strongly in American universities. You see it in the military, where people are accused of crimes that they cannot defend themselves against. Criminal accusations, quasi-criminal accusations, accusations of things that sound like crimes even though nobody knows quite what they are. But this is very, very strongly, well, it's become a big part of American politics. And it's something that Hillary Clinton is on the cutting edge of. It's something that Theresa May is on the cutting edge of. And it's something that same-sex marriage initiatives are on the cutting edge of as well. So it's something that needs to be thought about, at least. I won't go into great detail, but I can go into more detail if anybody's interested. I've given you 4 examples here of this trend. I think I could have chosen any other examples as well, a number of other examples. We just heard about the European Union and the United Nations. Most of what I can tell you, for one thing, especially the United Nations, most of what the United Nations does these days, on the below the radar screen, if you visit the United Nations and see what they do on any given day, most of the UN bureaucracy is engaged in some kind of politics involving sexuality. It's what they do most of the time. You don't see it, it's not on television, it's not on the news, it's not in the newspapers, but it's what the UN does most of the time. You heard about abortion, same-sex marriage a little bit. Those are the things, even though there's no actual warrant or mandate for those things in international law, they are what the United Nations spends most of its time doing, is sexual issues. The European Union, less so, but also, among the bureaucracy, that's a lot of what the European Union does. Even though sexual issues and family policy and family law are not part of the competence, if you know that term, the competence of the European Union. So I could have chosen other examples as well, but my point is just generally to make you think a little bit about how these issues, this kind of subtext, which I believe is running through much of our politics and which is going to increase, and I think it's going to increase here in East Central Europe as well. So, thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for your excellent presentation. And floor is open. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Baskerville, for a really interesting presentation. And I think it's a really perceptive insight how this sexual politics plays a crucial role as a subtext to much of our political discussion. I would push back a little bit on the Trump side. I would not so much disagree, but to say that for various reasons, some of what you indicated, the sexual issues were like, if you use an example from pathology, they were in the bloodstream, but they never metastasized. But they did, one thing that proves your point was that right after, immediately after, right around the time, I guess the day after Trump's inauguration, my city, Washington, was filled with tens of thousands of feminists with a women's march against Trump, denying that he was their president. So I think it's very interesting. But I want to probe with you and ask for your opinion about how you think this politics works out in the support of feminists for immigration, even from Islamic countries that have very different views about women.
Thank you. Questions? Actually, I wanted to point out this women's marches after the Trump election. Yes, as you say, there were women's marches throughout the United States. The striking thing about those women's marches, too, is it wasn't clear what their grievances were. They didn't have any specific grievances. Trump hadn't done anything. He hadn't even said much about women or family policy or women's issues. It kind of avoided those things. It wasn't even clear what they were protesting. There were no concrete grievances that they were listed. So it doesn't mean it's not important. I think it was very important. But it again shows how the cutting edge, especially of left-wing politics, has become sexual, not social or socialistic or economic or national or racial. Your question about how does this play out? Sorry, what was it again?
How does it?
Oh, immigration. Oh, that's very interesting. Yes, very complicated issue. Um, because yes, as you say, it does. As you say, a number of there've been a number of countries, Britain, especially where the Rotherham attacks, where women have been attacked by immigrant communities and so forth, and where immigration brings in communities and immigrants who don't have the same respect that we have in the West for women's rights and for individual rights generally. And yet, why did the feminist movement support this? It's very strange. I agree. This is very true. In fact, somebody made this point about Theresa May, that she also supported this. She did not defend her country well against immigration, even though some of the immigrants have been notorious for, immigrant communities have been notorious for failing to protect women's rights. The short answer I would give to that, to a complicated question, is that radical movements, organized political movements like feminism, like homosexual politics, are not necessarily about rights. They tend to be about power. And they tend to make alliances with other groups that are also about power. And so one can be for women's rights, one can be for homosexual rights. There's no doubt that homosexuals and women have certain rights like everyone else does, and they should be enforced like anyone else. But these radical movements get a momentum, which is, which develops far beyond their actual substance of the issues they deal with, and they're very much in the pursuit of power. So they tend to form, as we say, strange bedfellows. They tend to form alliances with other radical movements, like Islamism. Why does the radical left ally itself with radical Islamist movements? And they do. They do. It's very clear. Why do feminist groups ally themselves with radical Islamist movements? And they do. Quite clearly. Again, I would argue that radical ideologies are really about power. Why did Hitler ally himself with Stalin and vice versa? Because they were both the common pursuit of power. And that's the bottom line. That's the best succinct answer I can give to that question.
Thank you, Professor Stephen, for your presentation. I'd like to focus on the feminist reaction to President Trump. I would say that the feminist reaction to the election of President Trump would rather center on the rhetorics or on the the remarks that what could be perceived as an anti-feminist remarks, rather than on the policy. There's a difference between, for example, between what a person would say against certain people as against what would be the course of action that he will take, what sort of policy he will institute. And I would say the question is there a connection between the rhetorics and the policy, or the remarks against some people, like for example the feminists? Because we can also see these, for example, in the Philippines. Our president Duterte has been accused of being anti-women because of his remarks, because of his rhetorics. He often makes a joke, for example, about rape, and he's very famous for this. But some people would say that if you're going to check the record or the track record of Duterte regarding welfare of women, has instituted certain programs that promote the welfare of women, for example, when he was mayor in the South, and even when he issued presidency. So there is sometimes there is a disconnect between the rhetorics and the policy. So I think that's one avenue that probably analysts or critics could explore. Up to what extent these two, the rhetorics, the pronouncement, affect the policy.
That's a good question. There's been there's been a lot of, the problem is we've seen the politicization of policies, both criminal and civil policies dealing with the family and dealing with, you know, with criminal matters. I mean, nobody, I hope nobody, I mean, I'm sure we all agree that rape is a crime that should be punished. So is violence, violent assault, you know, so is stalking. I mean, the standard things we hear about are crimes, and they should be punished. They should be punished with due process of law. There should be protections for those who are accused, for the protections for the innocent, but they should be punished. The problem is that, first of all, the feminist movement has politicized these things. First of all, rape, assault, stalking, all of these things are already crimes in every jurisdiction on earth, and they are punished. The feminists, however, have politicized these things and made them into political red flags. As a result of that, some other people on the other side, or should we say some conservative politicians, trying to be provocative or trying to rebel against this, have made some very stupid statements. This has happened in the United States, where they've made some statements seeming to dismiss rape or domestic violence and so forth. And this is unfortunate, and it's wrong, and it's not very constructive as well. So there's been kind of a very bad attempts to be provocative, attempts to be politically provocative on both sides, and that's a failure to really understand what's going on here. And what's going on here is the larger problem that's going on here is the politicization of the judiciary and the politicization of the law, the criminal law, and the politicization of the family. I mean, those are all things that have become dangerous trends that have a much larger context than what I've discussed here.
Thank you. I'd like to refer to the previous question that has been raised by Professor Farina, because I think that somehow brings both the panels on both the talks, the one about the human rights and the one about sex and politics, to a sort of common denominator. I think that the main reason why feminists support migration and support, Islamism, is that they simply don't see the issue as the conservatives I see. Is that feminists, they don't perceive migration as an act of the clash of civilization, as an act of cultural war, as the conservatives do. They simply see it as a sort of the very shallow human rights issue. Is about poor people coming up and we should help them. So they stay at this level, being ideologically motivated, of course, and they don't go into the depth. They don't go into the depth of a perception that involves cultural issues and this kind of things. So yes, you're right. I have to tell you, I have a personal experience on that. 1 year ago, I talked to a friend of mine who's gay, and he was very much supporting the migration. It was a huge scandal in the European Union. And I told him, I said, you know what the Islamists are doing to the gay people? I mean, they throw them from the buildings. They kill them with stones. Do you have any idea what these guys are thinking about people like you? And he was shocked. He said, well, yes, but these kind of things would never happen in Europe. So let them come. I mean, it is, yeah, because they simply see, again, politically motivated, ideologically motivated, they don't see that far. So that's why I think this is how that. Second, I have to tell you that I love whenever I meet Americans talking so passionately about European Union. It's very good for us to hear your perspective. So that's why, if you don't mind, I would say a few words about the US campaign, telling you that I'm not that sure that the sex issue was totally out of the campaign. I remember in that moment when they put publicly that tape with the locker room Polish talk of Donald Trump about how to approach a lady, and at the same time, as a reply from Donald Trump, bringing up the eternal Clinton issue. Come on, when you talk about Clinton, you cannot avoid sex. I mean, and in the political battle, Trump really replied very hard on Clinton issue that we all know. So sex was there, but I think that in this, if you want sex war, nobody won. So it was a draw. So that's why maybe it was not pregnant, because you know, Hillary attacked him on his disrespect, which was obviously an erotical disrespect to women, and he counterattacked, remembering everybody how Bill Clinton behaved with women, and it was a draw. So that's why maybe it was not that decisive. And I would like also to say a few words about this approach of feminists about Muslims, saying that, you know what the paradox with the liberals is that they started as apologists of difference. They said, gay people, they are different, we have to respect their differences. Atheists, they are different, we have to respect their differences. I don't know, Buddhists, they are different, we have to respect. Islamic, Muslims, they are different, we have to respect. And they end up as hysterical supporters of a homogeneous world, where there is no whatsoever difference between a Christian and a Muslim, and wherever a Christian, for instance, insists on that difference, he got a very harsh answer from a liberal, who again, they started by chanting the praises and praising the virtues of difference. So that's why I think they are a very shallow and superficial vision on these kind of issues. Thank you.
Thank you for those interesting comments. I could spend a lot of afternoon giving variations on that, but I'll just respond to a couple of points you raised, which is interesting. First of all, the immigration issue. It's full of ironies involving Islamists, feminists, and others on the immigration issue. For example, in immigration, feminists have created a situation where an accusation of domestic violence is a silver bullet to go to the front of the queue for immigration. So if you don't get your immigration accepted, if you're turned down, just claim domestic violence against somebody, and you go to the front of the queue and you get into the country automatically. But the interesting one, very interesting one, we've tied ourselves in knots over this one. I'll do it very briefly. The issue of human trafficking is very interesting. This human trafficking, this term was created by feminists. In fact, Hillary Clinton was involved in this. It was created by radical feminists. And it seems to have been created as a way of, again, as a form of violence against women. Then what happened was conservatives took it over, Christian groups especially, and the Bush administration took this over and used it as a way of clamping down on immigration and prostitution. And the feminists said, no, that's not what we meant. We wanted to legalize prostitution. And so they started backtracking and changing it around so that they would have, prostitution would be legalized, but human trafficking would be a crime. Okay, and so then they got in all kinds of contorted positions, and all kinds of ironies, where you have to, you're not sure who your allies are and what is the politically correct position to take on these issues. So it's you can see how ideology completely muddles our politics. And you said some very interesting things, but I can't remember all of them right now, so I'll let somebody else take over.
Just, we have time for just one more question.
Okay, to Professor Baskerville, but not only. Since you brought religion into the discussion and suggested, as far as I understood, that the battleground is to some extent religious, I was wondering if, in your opinion, we're seeing some kind of reactivation of religious or traditional values? And if there is some kind of resistance or maybe even a clash between societies as described in introduce new values as described in the previous presentation.
Yes, that's a good question. I do certainly think that we do see, reintroduction of religious values and religious clashes. The question is, why is it happening, and what are we to make of it? Some of it's intertwined with nationalism and ethnicity, of course, but I think there's more to it than that. I think the fall of communism had a lot to do with it. I think the old secular ideologies, like Marxism, are no longer plausible. They're discredited. Nobody, except a few academics, will defend Marxism. And so what's happened is the old Marxist ideology has been splintered. Part of the world has moved toward Islamism, which has recycled some of the old Marxist grievances, but in religious terms. For example, they attack the West for exploitation, they attack the West for capitalism, they attack the West for imperialism. Okay, so on the one hand, they take the old left-wing grievances and they cast them in religious terms. On the other hand, they also understand the power of sexual morality. So they take this, they've achieved a kind of a sexual puritanism, which also gives them, I think, much more power and urgency than secular ideology ever did. So basically what they've created is religious ideologies, or combined religious, very violent and sometimes terroristic, political and sexual ideology, which is very potent and very, obviously terrifying. Elsewhere in the Western world, the Marxism has kind of given way to this more sexual ideology also, in the form of feminism and homosexualism as well, which was there. I mean, that came out in the Bolshevik Revolution. It came back as early as the French Revolution. But it's emerged as dominant, again, since 1989, since the collapse of communism. So in the West, you've got this sexual ideology, feminism and homosexualism on the one hand, and in the West, in the South, you've got Islamism, Hindutva, politicized Buddhism, all of which also have a very strong ultra-masculine aspect to it. And so it's very complicated, but I think that's basically the polarity that we're seeing in the world today. And we haven't yet learned how to deal with that. We're still fighting, the cliche, we're still fighting the previous war. We're fighting the wars of yesteryear. Socialism, communism, racism, fascism. That's not what's happening today.
One more short question. So, okay, we conclude this session. Now, all of you are invited to lunch.
Is it out there, Dan? Is it out there? Is lunch out there?